All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Rev War Revelry. I am Rob Orson with the Emerging Revolutionary War. I'm happy to be joined here with one of our regular returning hosts, Bert Dunkerly. Bert is here tonight to talk about the Battle of Eutaw Springs. If you haven't already purchased it, Bert has a great book out he co-authored here on the Battle of Eutaw Springs. I'm sure he'll talk a little bit more about the book as we go on. But tonight we're going to talk about one of the last battles in the Southern campaigns during the American Revolution. Got my Liberty hat on tonight in honor of South Carolina. And this is all kind of building up to, as some of you all know, we're doing our annual bus tour this year in Charleston, South Carolina. That's November 10th through 11th. 10th through 12th, I'm sorry. And we do have 6 tickets left. So the tickets are going pretty fast. We're very excited about that. Also excited to say that Bert will be joining us this year and helping us do the Sunday portion of the tour, which will be the Battle of Eutaw Springs. So Bert, welcome and thanks for coming out tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Bert, like I said, has been with us many times. Bert has probably authored more books in the American Revolution than the rest of the ERW authors combined. I don't know how you do it, Bert, but I'm very jealous and envious of all the time you get to write. Let's get started with trying to set Eutaw Springs and kind of the big picture. If you can kind of briefly take us from Guilford Courthouse, which a lot of our viewers probably recognize as one of the larger battles in the Southern campaign with Nathanael Greene. Take us from Guilford to Eutaw Springs and how we got there.
Sure. So Guilford Courthouse is fought in March 1781. And after the battle, the two armies separate. The British win the battle technically, but they're very badly beat up, low on supplies. So General Cornwallis will move his army down to the coast of North Carolina to Wilmington, which is in British hands. And at Wilmington, he can rest, be resupplied. He's in a safe place where his troops will not fear attack because Wilmington has been occupied by the British for several months already, and they fortified around the town. And then Cornwallis is convinced that Virginia is the key to subduing the southern states. And we could talk more about the issue with his boss, General Clinton, who disagrees with that, but Cornwallis wants to carry the war into Virginia. And so later in the spring, in April, the British will move out of Wilmington and march directly north up towards Petersburg and take the war into Virginia. And what they do is they leave behind a small force in Wilmington and small forces to hold on to what they've got in South Carolina. The British have considered it conquered. They consider the fact that they've been through it and they own it, but it's not quite the case. The British have small garrisons in places like 96 and Charleston, Georgetown, and a few other places across South Carolina. What General Greene does, instead of following Cornwallis all the way to Wilmington and then across eastern North Carolina, he'll move his army down into South Carolina to try to retake that state, feeling that Virginia has troops and will get more reinforcements and can hold its own. And so that spring of 1781, the Americans under General Greene will move back into South Carolina, and they'll try to attack the series of British posts like 96 and Camden, and by summer, Eutaw Springs.
So I think we talked briefly before we went on live, talk a little about the major players involved here at Eutaw Springs. So I think Nathanael Greene's well known. We can talk about him briefly, but talk about Alexander Stewart. That's a name that you really don't see. Where did Rawdon go? Why wasn't he there? Why was he in South Carolina when this battle took place?
So, we know about General Greene, of course, but on the American side, it's everybody's here, just about, except General Sumter, who's ill. But Pickens is there, Moultrie is there, a lot of the other, Henry Lee is there, William Washington is there. Some of the lesser known commanders that if you study the war in South Carolina, you've heard of Edward Lacey and Samuel Hammond and people like that. These guys fought at Cowpens and Kings Mountain and some of the important South Carolina battles. They're all there. On the British side, yes, Rawdon has left. Rawdon was the British commander who had been left by Cornwallis to hold South Carolina. He's gotten ill. He's been recalled. So Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Stewart, who no one's ever heard of, and this will be his only battle, the only battle that he oversees, but he sure takes advantage of the chance to shine. So Stewart is there. He's got a mixed force of British and Loyalist troops. And another name people might know is John Harris Kruger. Kruger commanded the Loyalist garrison at 96, which held off Greene's army at 96 for 2 weeks. Kruger is a New York Loyalist. He's probably the second in command of Stewart's force. But otherwise, just a small contingent of a lot of different forces under the British Army there.
So Stewart's forces, are they responsible for holding Charleston, or are they kind of a mobile force outside of Charleston?
They're ultimately responsible for Charleston. Charleston has its own garrison of British and some Hessian troops. But Stewart's force is at Eutaw Springs, which is about 30, maybe a little more miles, a little bit north of Charleston. And they're actually pulling back to get closer to the coast. Even though Greene has not been successful in a lot of his attacks at places like Hobkirk's Hill, Camden, and 96, the British hold out at all those places, but they're too weak to hold on to them. They're too isolated in those separated garrisons. So they're pulling their troops back towards the coast where they can be more concentrated, better supplied, better communication. And the British are at the point where they're kind of given up on holding the South Carolina interior.
All right, so you got Greene, who's trying to pick off these outposts. We know he went to 96 and wasn't very successful there, but eventually 96 would be abandoned by the British. As he's going toward Eutaw Springs, what's his plan of action? Is he trying to get around Stewart? Is he trying to take on Stewart head on in a battle?
I think Greene is very anxious to take Stewart on. And here's one of the things that I really emphasize in the book and that I want to emphasize tonight is when you think about it, in the whole of the revolution, a battle is a rare opportunity to inflict damage or destroy your enemy. Most of the time, these armies are camped or they're marching or they're moving around, but battles are few and far between. And it takes so long to build up your strength, to build up your supplies, to have the troops trained. But when you fight a battle, your troops are suffering casualties, command structure is torn apart, officers are wounded, the army gets disintegrated, organization breaks down, and then you've got to build it up again over a period of months and weeks after that. So these battles are rare, limited chances to inflict damage on the enemy. And so look at what Greene's already dealt with. At 96, he did not choose the ground. The British were already there. He did control the initiative. They launched attacks, but they weren't able to overwhelm the British and break through. At Hobkirk's Hill, the British attack him. So he doesn't have the initiative. At Guilford Courthouse, we'll go back to that. The British attack him. He does not control the initiative, does not control the flow of the battle. He's reacting. Eutaw Springs will be the only time in this phase of the Southern campaign that Greene's army chooses the ground and controls the initiative. It's the only time that Greene has both of those in his favor. He picks the time and place, and he is the one attacking. And so he is, I think, very anxious to make the most of it. And I think he's bitterly disappointed at how it turns out. We can get more into that.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. I didn't really think about that. This is, you made those good points about he doesn't really get to choose the ground of the situation. Here he kind of does. And of course, Greene's known for being a very successful general in the South, but he never really wins a battle. We can discuss this battle if he wins or loses at the end of our chat. But he's lose, bloody the enemy, live to fight again another day kind of strategy. And I think looking at the other battles you just mentioned, you're right. This is the only one really that he's being able to kind of dictate how things go. So what's his plan, Bert? How has he set up this attack on Stewart, and how does he, again, what's his ultimate goal other than destroying the British Army? How does he plan about doing that?
I want to first talk about the composition of the American Army because it's really important.
Sure.
Greene has a small core of veteran Continental troops. It's the Maryland Regiment, some of the Delaware Regiment, and these poor guys, they fought in all the major battles in the North. They were decimated at Camden. Someone should write a good book about that.
They should, right?
Yeah, they should.
A good book too.
A good one this time. Yeah. Those guys fought at Cowpens and Guilford. Extremely experienced combat veterans, but there's not many of them.
Right.
At Guilford Courthouse, the North Carolina militia, and not to disparage North Carolina, but they didn't stand very well. They were easily pushed back. A lot of them ran away. And so the North Carolina militia at Guilford Courthouse, the survivors of that are, as a punishment, enlisted into the Continental Army. And so North Carolina creates 3 very small regiments of Continental troops that are not really well supplied or organized, but they are there, dubious quality. Probably some of the best troops that Greene has are his South Carolina and North Carolina militia. And these are the guys who have fought at King's Mountain, Cowpens, Blackstocks, all the major and minor battles across the Carolinas. They're extremely experienced. They're extremely confident. So Greene's army is composed of those troops. He has a little bit of artillery and he has some cavalry. He has some Continental Dragoons and a lot of South Carolina mounted militia. And let me just say, on the British side, they have also a small force of regular troops. They're drawn from 5 different British regiments, but there's only small numbers of each of those troops there. Probably about half the British Army are Loyalists. They're from New York and New Jersey. And they are tough. They are tough guys. They're very experienced troops. They fought in a lot of battles. But Stewart's army is actually a little smaller than Greene's. And they will be caught completely off guard. Never saw it coming. The Americans will approach on September 8th, 1781. And Rob, I don't know if you want to get into the details of how it starts yet, but
yeah, Bert, go ahead.
Okay,
go right ahead.
So, it's still summer. It's still pretty hot in South Carolina, and every morning the British had gotten into the habit of sending out before dawn what they called a rooting party, and these were troops who were sent out to gather supplies, root for vegetables or whatever they could scavenge from local farms. Specifically, they were digging up sweet potatoes on this day. But it's about 300 men in this rooting party go out, and as the American army approaches and no one knows that they're coming, almost all of them are captured because they're not armed. And so right off the bat, the British lose some of their most experienced troops. Not all of them are captured. Some of them are just kind of scattered, but they're gone for the purposes of the battle. So that's a big blow. The British realize that the Americans are approaching. Stewart will send out some of his cavalry under a man named Colonel John Coffin. Not a great name.
Right.
Coffin's cavalry will bump into the Americans as they approach, and they'll skirmish, and the British will fall back, report on what's coming, and the British will form into a line of battle. The British are camped at Eutawville Springs. There were two springs, a big one and a little one. And we'll get into one of the myths and misconceptions about the flooding of the battlefield here later, but the British camp is at the springs. And so a little bit to the west of that is where they form up to defend it. Greene will deploy his army into three different lines. He has the militia line first, mostly South Carolinians, some North Carolina militia. Behind them are the North Carolina Continentals. And behind them are the Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia troops, who are his most reliable. And
Sounds like cow pens, Bert.
it's a cow pens in reverse. It is. Right. Because the Americans are attacking this time.
Right.
The South Carolina militia will engage. They'll fight very well, run low on ammunition, get pulled back. The North Carolina Continentals will then swap places and move up to the front line and engage the British. They'll start to waver, and the British will launch a charge. And one British officer says that this was actually very unfortunate because in charging, the British got disorganized. They charged too far. They pushed the North Carolina troops back. But in doing that, they overextended themselves. They got spread out. Their communication and organization broke down. And it's at that point that Greene sends in his last troops, the Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware troops. And they will charge forward and sweep the British off the field. And it's really an incredible moment because it's kind of what Greene's been waiting for. They've all been waiting for
right
this whole time. I mean, you never see this at Guilford or 96 or any of these other battles. The British are driven off the battlefield. They are pushed back. They take heavy casualties. The Continental troops and the Virginia state troops clear them out of the way, push them all the way back to their camp.
Well, that's the problem, right? So,
yes.
So, kind of segue into that. What happens? Obviously, this is a great moment for Greene, great moment for these men from North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, and even Maryland. If my friend Phil Greenwald's watching, I have to give my Maryland some props here.
Hopefully they weren't Ravens fans.
As well. That's a whole nother video. We can agree on that. But there's a lot put on the Continental Army, the Americans looting camps. So is that what happens, or is that been overblown too much, or is there some factual basis for that?
So one of the things I wanted to do in the book is address two misconceptions. One of them has to do with the flooding of the battlefield, which we can get to later. Mm-hmm. But the other is the idea of the Americans looting the British camp. So what happens is the British are driven back. Only one small group holds out off to the side. They're in a hedge. They're in a thicket where they're well protected. And we'll return to their story. But the bulk of the British army is driven back into their camp and beyond it. So their tents, their wagons, all their supplies. And the Americans pursue them and get into the camp. And I think one thing that happens is if you picture these tents laid out and the American troops moving forward, their formations are going to get broken up because they've got to separate to move through these obstacles. But just beyond the British camp was a brick house, and several of the British troops take refuge there and start shooting out the windows. Think Germantown. And there's a great account of literally American troops trying to push the front door in, and the British inside are pushing the door on the other side, and they slam it shut. And these guys are literally fighting at the front door of this house. But it's at this point that several key officers go down. Several of the Virginia and Maryland officers are wounded, and that starts to lead to some disorganization and breakdown. The troops are spread out and scattered. It's anytime you have this kind of success, it only goes so far. I mean, look at Civil War battles like Cedar Creek or Stones River or Shiloh. There's a point where you carry yourself too far and disorganization sets in. So I think that starts to happen. The British reorganize, they regroup, and they counterattack and push the Americans back. Now, as far as the looting of the camp, guess how many examples I found?
2. That's not a lot. That's
There
not a lot.
And I looked at every account that I could from both sides, and there are only 2 American accounts that talk about looting the camp. No British accounts. It was their camp. But so yes, I think it happened. I'm sure it did. But did it play a decisive factor in the army breaking apart and being pushed back? I don't think so. So to carry the story forward, the Americans pull back. Greene realizes, hey, we've done the best we could. I've used all my troops. We've got to pull back. Nothing else to put into it. So the army will pull back a couple miles and spend the night. But that, I think, is definitely one of the misconceptions. It happened, but it was not to the degree that made the difference.
Right. And, a few of us were just up in Germantown last weekend with Michael Harris at the Chew House. It's very similar, right? But you don't really read a whole lot about this situation at Eutawville Springs. I wonder if that's kind of because Washington wasn't there, right? There's that Washington kind of, we joke about it. If Washington's not there, it didn't happen. But it sounds very, very familiar, similar to what happened at the Chew House there in Germantown with the British soldiers put themselves in the house and use it as kind of like a fortress. So you mentioned, and we didn't get back to, let's get back to that British unit that you said was kind of in the hedge there, kind of protected. What role did they play in kind of turning the tide here for Stewart and his army?
So on the British far right flank, which was near the Santee River, in a hedgerow, it's a group of light infantry who are some of the best troops that the British have. They're from 3 different regiments, and they're under the command of an officer named Marshbanks. And they hold out while the rest of the army retreats. And they become such an annoyance that the American dragoons under William Washington, cousin of the other Washington. Yeah, whoever that is. They will launch a cavalry charge against these guys and just get decimated. One squadron of Washington's cavalry will lose all 16 men, killed or wounded. Overall, a third of the American cavalry is shot down.
Wow.
And Washington himself
right.
is wounded and captured and will sit out the rest of the war in British-held Charleston as a prisoner. So that's one thing that also helps stem the American tide and drain their momentum is this little force that holds out on the end of the line. And then the rest of the British army will surge back to push the Americans back.
All right. So Greene's been pushed off the field per se. So let's tackle this argument among historians. Who won the battle? I think generally speaking, people believe Greene won the battle, but the way you're describing it doesn't sound like that. So kind of give your perspective on who won the battle and why you think, your reason is the right one.
I would say the battle is a draw.
Oh, that's the easy way out, Bert. Come on.
Oh, come on. Draws are real things.
Yes, they are.
No, the Americans attack. They push the British back, but the British counterattack and drive them away. neither side has a clear-cut victory. If you want to give it to anybody, give it to Stewart. His smaller force holds out. The Americans had pushed them back, had captured the camp. They had won the battle. The battle had ended at that point. There'd be a Eutawville Springs National Military Park there with a visitor center and guided tours and all that stuff, because it would be a famous victory site. But no, seriously, I think that give it to anybody. I would give it to the British. Both sides fight hard. Battle lasts for 4 hours in the heat, and tremendous casualties, which I'd love to talk more about, but no clear-cut winner. But the British hold the same ground at the end of the day.
Reading some of the comments here in the chat, so I keep looking off to the side. People are actually going to the battlefield, Bert, with your book. There you go.
Good.
I can tell you all watching, there's no better feeling for a historian knowing that people are visiting the sites with your book, using it as a guide. So, and you do have a guide in the back of the book. So be sure to pick this up. Someone asked for the title. It's Eutawville Springs, the final battle of the American Revolution's Southern Campaign. You can get it on Amazon or Amazon and any place else, Bert, like to promote that, or Amazon's good.
Amazon, and it's published by University of South Carolina Press.
Yep, just saw that.
So you can order it directly from them. Go to their website.
Yeah, support them as much as can, because we love our publishers who publish our books. So Casualties, you kind of alluded to this a little bit. So you said you wanted to dive more into that. It is a bloody battle. It is, we're going to get to another question about why it's important or forgotten, but go ahead and tell us a little bit about the casualties.
So the Americans have about 2,000 men. They will lose over 500.
Sure.
The British have 1,300, and they will lose almost 700. Just a little bit short of 700 men. When you see casualty rates above 10%, that's extreme. But when you see casualty rates of 20 and 50%, it's off the chart. Almost every British unit, individual regiment, will lose a third to half of their men. And the only thing I would say to account for it is that these are veteran troops. They're motivated. They're standing their ground, and there's a lot of hand-to-hand combat, which often doesn't happen in the Revolution. But we have a lot of accounts of bayonet wounds, saber wounds, head wounds. People using muskets as baseball bats. It's pretty brutal stuff, and it's happening here.
That's what's the landscape like? Does the landscape play into that casualties any at all? Like, what's the lay of the land as far as vegetation and such during the battle?
So it's fairly flat. And so not a lot of natural features for protection, which is probably another reason why the casualties are so high.
All right. So why is this battle important, Bert? So close to Yorktown, just a few months away from not the end of the war, but end of the major fighting. We'll say that. We can't agree on that. So why is this important? And do you think it's been forgotten, or do you think it's been given its just due?
So why is it important? It's kind of the last blow for the British. After this, they are just far too weak to do anything in the interior of the state. Stewart's force will pull back into Charleston, and the British are just going to hold on to Charleston and Georgetown and not really venture inland anymore for the rest of the war. They just don't have the strength. They don't have the local support from the population. Now, Greene's army is pretty battered as well, but within a few months, the Pennsylvania troops from Washington's army in Virginia will march down, and Greene's army will be reinforced and be much stronger than the British, and they'll get resupplied and refitted and rested up. And as far as Eutawville Springs being overshadowed by Yorktown, absolutely, it's fought just a month before Yorktown. Yorktown is going to, obviously take center stage after that. And because it's not a clear-cut victory for either side, especially for the Americans. I mean, they fight hard. They really do. They have a lot of success, but they come up short. If it had been a clear-cut victory, you'd hear more about it. And I think that leads to the battlefield wasn't preserved. And in the 1920s and 30s, when a lot of these other battlefields are created as parks. And so that leads back to, well, if it's not preserved, there's nothing to see and go visit there, then people forget about it. So I think it becomes a cycle in historical memory like that. But thankfully, our friends from the Battlefield Trust and the South Carolina Battleground Trust and Palmetto Conservation, all kinds of groups are coming together to preserve the battlefield now.
Well, that's another great segue. You read my mind here, Bert. Let's talk about, some of the archaeology and some of the rediscovery of the battlefield. People have been bringing up the flooding and the lake and some of the misconceptions about where the battle took place. Up until very recently, it happened out, in the reservoir, in the river, in the lake there. So some research has been done. You were involved in some of this and some of the archaeology that was done. Kind of give us a little, a brief overview of like how that research went about and what we learned from it.
Can I share some pictures?
Yeah. Here, I will. Let's see. Should be able to.
Okay, let me pull something up here.
There you go.
All right, so let me just show you all a couple pictures here.
We should have brought up the map when we're doing the battle. That's on me, Bert. Sorry, I should have asked you to do that.
All right. All right, so here's an old photograph of Eutawville Springs. This is from the 30s. This is what it looked like. Today it's underwater. But take a look right here. On the left is a modern photo of the lake, Lake Marion. It's now there today. On the right, that's another 1930s photo. So you can see how much, the water level today is up here at the top of this, the land. That's what you're seeing over here on the left. So you can see how much has been flooded at the springs. And on the bottom, that's a sketch from the 1850s. Benson Lossing sketch, who traveled all over visiting Revolutionary War sites, just to give you another view of what the historic springs look like.
That's a huge slope. I mean, that's pretty big.
So bear with me because this isn't easy to grasp at first, but these two maps are showing the same area. On the left is 1909, and on the right is current. And if you see my cursor here, this road is this road over here. So this road that runs left to right is the same road over here. And on the left, in the old map, you see the Santee River right there. The river would be over here on the modern map, but the modern lake has flooded out to inundate all the low-lying area. But most of the battlefield, which is centered on this road, still there. So if you compare the pre-flooding map with the post-flooding map, and this was done in the 40s, it was a public power project to create the lake. It did not flood most of the battlefield, very little, just the fringe. And if you look at the map on the right here, there's a little neighborhood. That neighborhood built in the 60s did more damage than the flooding. But today, like I said, there's some groups that are preserving land, and we're going to see some of that on our tour in November.
Thanks for bringing those maps up, because that's, you had this in your book as well, and you go into the how this is really kind of, people think a lot of this stuff's been researched enough already, but there's always more to learn. There's always new technology to help us learn, LiDAR, different technology, different archaeological techniques help us kind of find these battlefields now. So there you go, some archaeology right there.
Yeah. So one of the real breakthroughs was in the 2000s. It might have been around 2007 or six, somewhere in that time frame. An archaeological study was done, and I talked about that brick house that stood by the British camp. That was the key. If you find the house, you'll find the heart of the battlefield, because the British camp was right there. And from that point, you can calculate where everything else was. And as you can see, they found some bricks. They found the foundations of this house, along with a lot of military artifacts. So this was a tremendous discovery. And it allowed us, anyone who's studying the battle, to know precisely where that house was, where the British camp was, and where everything else would now fall into place. So that was a major breakthrough. And we'll see this site on our tour.
There you go. I like the way Bert promotes the tour. I like it.
Yeah. Only 6 tickets left, right?
There you go. 6 tickets left. Right. It is pretty amazing to see some of this research and kind of change how we interpret the battle. So as we're talking about, this research and how interpretation has changed, I have to ask you personally, what kind of drew you to the story? What made you interested in Eutawville Springs? What about the battle? What about the personalities that kind of drew you to this, to put so much time and effort into researching and writing a book about it, which we all know takes a lot of time?
One thing I noticed was when I started taking an interest in it in the early 2000s, hard to believe it's been that long now.
Right.
There'd been books about cow pens. Larry Babbitt's great book about cow pens. There have been several good books about Guilford Courthouse. People have written about all the other major battles. Carl Borick's Charleston book. But no one had done a serious study of Eutawville Springs. And I thought, wow, that's just begging to be done. And when I got into it, it was just fascinating. It was fascinating. And I think I learned a lot, and I tried to put all of that into the book. There's so many great stories and incidents and things that happen that were just never understood and need to be talked about.
I think, the casualties and looking at this battle and through that lens probably shocks some people, surprises some people. Rev War battles, tend to not to be, over that 10%, but this is much higher than that. And I think it makes it definitely, every battle is important to study because someone gave their life there. But looking at this battle, the way you've been bringing it to life tonight in the book, it's definitely important because of those casualties. So we always talk about, since we're all public historians here, and we spend countless hours at the battlefield and historic sites where we all prefer to be. What's there to see now? If someone doesn't take our bus tour, which you have to if you want to get the great tour from Bert, but if you were to go there today, you mentioned ABT and some other groups, what's there today to kind of let people know what happened?
Really, there's one thing to see, and it's worth seeing. It's not far off 95 if you're driving through South Carolina. If you live in South Carolina, go see it. But there's a small roadside park with a couple historic markers. There's no visitor center, no museum or anything like that. It's just a roadside park. And that's where the brick house stood. That's where the archaeology was done. That's where the British camp was. It's at the site of the springs. You can walk over to the edge of the lake, and you see that's where the springs the water still bubbles up. That's where the springs are, just underwater now. And there's a couple monuments, Daughters of the American Revolution monument, and a couple historic markers. That's where the battle reached its peak. Now, the start of the battlefield, that site has been preserved by the Battlefield Trust, It was an old restaurant and parking lot that they purchased, and we'll stop there on the bus tour. 6 tickets left.
Actually, there's only 2. Someone just bought 4. Go ahead, Bert.
All right.
Bert has
All right.
earned
2
his
tickets
beer tonight.
So that restaurant site is where the American Army arrived and deployed into battle, and that'll be one of our key stops on the bus tour. About half the battlefield today is built over with houses. About half on the other side of the road is open space, still undeveloped, woods. So there is potential to save more of the battlefield and potentially create a little park. Who knows where this could go?
Mhm. Yeah, and the ABT, South Carolina Battlefield Trust, a lot of these groups, with the Liberty Trail that they're designing, that is connecting a lot of these stories. 96, Camden, obviously, Cowpen, all over South Carolina. So I think hopefully with the 250th coming up, that really will draw a lot of interest and tourism to some of these sites. I know there's a lot of great groups in South Carolina helping the ABT protect some of this land. So we do have a couple questions.
All
I
right.
don't like putting our speakers on the spot, but I'm going to put them on the spot here for a little bit. People have been asking, well, the first question is, someone watching, Bert, had an ancestor that was wounded. Do you know where, and this is kind of a hard question, but we can always get the answer back to me if you don't know it right now. Do you know where the American wounded might have been taken after the battle? Their ancestor, their pension states that they were slashed with a saber and ran through with a bayonet, which ties in to what you're saying about that hand-to-hand combat, the ferocity of the battle. Do you know anything about where the hospitals were?
The American Army retreats to a place called Burdell's Plantation, which is about 7 miles from the battlefield.
Okay. Not too far.
We don't know exactly where that was. At least I don't. I don't know of anyone who did when I was researching the book. So the wounded who could move and could be taken would have been taken there. And then from there, the Americans will pull back to the high hills of Santee, which is an area much further to the north, where they're going to rest for the next couple of weeks. So I imagine some of the badly wounded might have been left at Burdell's, and those who could move went with the rest of the army. But it's probably just something that we're just not going to know.
Right. Well, 7 miles, I mean, you might have mentioned this earlier, but Greene pulls back about 7 miles. Does Stewart pull immediately back into Charleston, or what does he end up doing after the battle?
Yeah, the British stay for maybe a day or so, and then they pull back to Charleston. They take their wounded and their prisoners, whatever they can carry with them, and go. They don't stay long either.
A couple other questions here. I'm going to group 2 of them together. People don't like me. Want to talk about Francis Marion, Bert. We got the Swamp Fox. Does Francis Marion, and what's the role that Marion and Lee play in this overall action?
So Marion commands a militia unit. They're in the first part of the battle, the first ones to engage. I can't say anything specific other than they fight well, and he does well, as he always does. Nothing in particular stands out. As far as Lee, so there's an interesting controversy with Harry Lee. As the battle reaches that tipping point where the Americans can't go any further and the British are starting to regroup, Greene ordered Lee to make a cavalry charge to try to stem the tide and keep the momentum going, but Lee could not be found. It seems that Lee was, these guys are spread out. They can't text each other. Lee was out there, but just couldn't be located in the moment. And so his cavalry charged without him and didn't do well, took some casualties. There has been criticism of Lee after the battle. I don't know that Lee did anything wrong. I don't think Lee was delinquent. I think it's just one of those situations where in the heat of the moment, the messenger couldn't find him. Think about being out on a battlefield in the woods. How do you find one particular person with all this commotion and movement going on?
And Lee was aggressive. He was not afraid of going into battle. If you study Light Horse, we've had a couple of our Sunday night chats talk about Light Horse Harry Lee. He was not one to shy away from fighting. One last question here. It's interesting too. A lot of people watching tonight have ancestors that fought in this battle. A few people actually live on the battlefield, which is very interesting. That
Good.
you know, I mean, it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
They're talking about their own experiences actually being on the battlefield. One last question here before we wrap up. Someone's asking, do we know where the graves are of any of the men that died there? Or have they found any through the archaeology that you are aware of, or do we know where some of these men are buried?
The archaeology did not find any remains, but it was limited. It was only, in a limited area. It wasn't a widespread
Right.
project. As far as I know, the burial site has never been determined or talked about. We don't know exactly where they were buried. To me, it's always common sense that the dead are going to be buried at the site of the heaviest fighting. You're not going to drag these guys around.
Right.
It's a hot summer day. My belief has always been that the dead are buried on the battlefield, and still today in unmarked graves, and maybe in the future will be located. It would be nice to properly mark them and recognize them.
Which, this year's been, well, this 2022 was a big year for archaeology on Reservoir battlefields. Red Bank, they found Hessian burials. Camden, they found burials on the battlefield there. They'll be reinterring those in April. Some of us will be making our trip down there for that event. So, yeah, it's great that they're finding these locations, because actually in Camden, not to steer away from Eutawville Springs, but where they find those burials really helps kind of lay out the battle lines there. Of course, Camden's a crazy battle. All these battles are crazy, but it kind of helps interpret that story better. So you're probably right. So whoever asked that question, they're probably, some of those men are probably still there. And the more we're able to preserve this land, the better chance we have of finding them.
Absolutely.
So I am going to see any other questions. Not really. So Bert, any last words about Eutawville Springs before we wrap up for the evening?
I'll just share a quote from Colonel Stewart that I've always liked, and it's such a human reaction. I think we can all relate to this. Have you ever regretted something? Have you ever had second thoughts about something? Stewart, after the battle, would write, let me find it here. There are two circumstances in that action which I shall regret as long as I live. The one was not having cavalry to profit of the rout of the enemy infantry. The other was my rooting party being out and not having joined me till after the action was over. So here's Colonel Stewart, the only major battle he's going to command in. He doesn't know that, but this will be the only major battle that he's in charge of. And he says to the rest of his days, he would regret he didn't have enough cavalry to properly fight the battle, and that rooting party was out in the morning and got captured, and he lost a good chunk of his army before it even started. So just fun things to think about.
Yes. It's always easy to look back and say, well, if I should have done this, I could have done that. Well, hey, Bert, thank you very much for joining us again. Like I said, Bert's been with us many times talking about many different battles and personalities across the war, and we appreciate it. For those who want to catch our next Reservoir Revelry, it'll be on February 19th, 2 weeks from tonight. My buddy Mark Malloy will be having another good friend of ours, Mike Cecere, on to talk about his new book, which is Williamsburg During the American Revolution, just coming out recently. If you want to catch any of the other 200 hours of revelries, and we're almost 3 years into this, by the way. We started this when COVID started, and we've been doing it ever since. We love doing it. We have over 200 hours of free content with different authors, historians, museum professionals. You can catch all of those on our YouTube channel and also on our podcast channel. They're great. Mark and I drove up to Germantown last weekend listening to Michael Harris's podcast with us. It was perfect to get us ready for the tour we did with him. And finally, speaking of tours, as Bert's been mentioning so good, and I owe Bert some beer, even some Iron City, Bert. I'll say that here publicly. If you want to catch the tour, the tickets are on emergingrevolutionarywar.org, our website. People have been purchasing during the talk here. We have 2 left, so thank you all for that. That tour will be November 10th through 12th. We'll be covering the Siege of Charleston, both battles of Charleston with Mark Malloy, and of course, our guest tonight, Bert Dunkerly, will be talking about Eutawville Springs on Sunday. So with that, thanks again, Bert. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you all in 2 weeks, and take care.